The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, looks at all of those factors that I discussed when we talked about the Nelson model, right? I mean, the IMF doesn't call it the Nelson model, but they look at those exact same factors. And so they use that analysis to decide, is a country ready to have a financial crisis? And if so, then the IMF stands ready and willing to help that country because the IMF's, remember, its whole mission is to help maintain stable uh, global economic outcomes, to help maintain stable exchange rates. The IMF is trying to help countries avoid these crises, or if they do happen, at least to manage them effectively. Now, the reason this is relevant to you, I mean, it's relevant not only because now you can predict these kinds of crises before they happen, that's useful, but it's also relevant because you can find out that if the IMF does provide assistance to a country, it doesn't just give that financial assistance without any strings attached. It imposes what we call conditions. And so this is the infamous IMF conditionality. And I say infamous rather than just famous because this is very well known, especially among business people, because when the IMF imposes these conditions, they often have a significant impact on a country's economy, and that in turn can have a significant impact on the country's business environment. Often, in fact, these IMF conditions, at least temporarily, can have a very severely negative impact on the country's economy. So let's talk about exactly how that works, why the IMF does that. And remember, the IMF is doing this just meant to kind of impose these conditions in the short term to help the country recover. And then the IMF will lift the conditions, the country can go back to normal. So that's how the IMF sees what it's doing. Of course, structuralists and economic nationalists have somewhat different views on this because they have a different way of looking at the IMF. And we'll talk about all that. But what I want to do first is explain what exactly is IMF conditionality and how does the IMF see that. Now, to understand that, I mean, first, basic overview of what is this IMF. It is based, by the way, its headquarters is in Washington, D.C. in the United States. And that's because when the IMF was set up right after World War II, the idea was, look, the country that contributes the most to this International Monetary Fund, well, that's the country where the headquarters should be located. And so to this day, the country that contributes the most to the International Monetary Fund, the single country, is the United States. And so the headquarters continue to be in the United States. I know that the European countries together, the EU, right, collectively probably contributes more to the IMF, but the IMF bylaws say that it is the single country. And so that little kind of provision means that it continues to be in the United States. One other interesting aspect of the International Monetary Fund and how it works is that the managing director of the IMF, who is appointed by the IMF Executive Board for a 5-year term, has always been European. And so that continues to this day. The current managing director is from France. Her name is Christine Lagarde. She is the former finance minister of France. And so that isn't a written requirement. It isn't in the bylaws of the IMF. It's just a tradition that continues to this day. By the way, the president of the World Bank Group, which we'll talk about later, is always, again, by tradition, an American. So be that as it may, you can imagine the structuralists have some views about this. They might say, well, why is it always a European from a developed country that's managing director of the IMF or president of the World Bank Group is American? Why is that? So that's a very interesting debate, but that's just been the tradition so far. So let's now talk about how the IMF works. Now, I don't want to go into great depth and detail on this. We could be here for hours if I did. But suffice to say that when a country decides to become a member of the IMF, which of course then entitles that country to financial assistance from the IMF, if that country experiences a crisis, as we've described, well, to get access to this, to be a member of the IMF, the country needs to pay a subscription fee. And so that subscription fee is proportional to the size of that country's economy. So we measure the size of a country's economy with a measure called the gross domestic product, GDP. And the GDP just measures the amount of goods and services bought in a country's economy in any given year, the amount of transactions of goods and services in a country's economy in any given year. So clearly, some countries have larger GDPs than others. Those countries would have a larger quota size, more money they could draw upon from the IMF if they were to have a crisis. They also then have to, pay a larger subscription fee. The subscription fee to be a member of the IMF is proportional to the size of your GDP, and that sort of makes sense, right? Now, that subscription fee that countries have to pay in, and by the way, they don't physically pick up money and send it to IMF headquarters in Washington, D.C. They just keep that money set aside in their accounts, in their central bank. And so that money belongs to the IMF. That isn't for us to use. That's the IMF's money. If the country has a crisis, the IMF may need that money to provide financial assistance to the country. So that's how that money physically is arranged. Now, the size of the subscription fee is equal to 25% of the quota. So should a country need financial assistance from the IMF, well, it has that whole quota to draw upon, but the subscription fee is equal to 25% of that amount, right? So if that makes sense. And so of that 25%, now we're getting into too many details, then some of that must be in gold or hard currencies that are readily exchanged like US dollars or euros. The other can simply just be the country's own domestic currency. Okay, so enough about subscription fees. The bottom line there is that they are proportional to the size of the country's economy, and they entitle the country to a quota. If it experiences a financial crisis, the country can draw upon that quota. The country would not get access to its entire quota amount from the IMF all at once. The country would only get access to tranches or slices of that quota. And so the IMF uses the French word for slice or portion, tranche. And of course, I know I'm not pronouncing it as those who speak French as a native language would, but forgive me for that. But that is what the word the IMF uses for these slices of the quota. So if a country has a financial crisis, it would first get perhaps the first tranche, the reserve tranche. By the way, the reserve tranche, or sometimes called the gold tranche, is just the subscription fee that the IMF paid. Remember, that's equal to 25% of the quota. So the IMF says, well, look, you're having a financial crisis. You need some financial assistance. Perhaps you're experiencing on the brink of a big currency devaluation. You've run out of US dollars in your central bank to buy up excess local currency to help keep your currency stable. We will give you some money. But, first of all, keep in mind, you had a subscription fee. That money is sitting right there in your own accounts. You can use that. So the IMF calls that the reserve tranche or the gold tranche, because back in the old days, countries had to pay their entire subscription fee in gold. Now they can pay in a mix of gold or hard currency or domestic currency, right? But so the IMF says, go ahead and dip into your subscription fee. But if the country continues to need help, then the IMF will say, okay, now you can start to dip into your quota. And again, the IMF does this in these tranches, right? So the 25% of the quota at a time. So the first tranche, the first 25% of the quota, there are no conditions imposed whatsoever. The IMF says, okay, these kinds of crises happen once in a while. You can get access to your first tranche. But if the country says we still need help, we're in a deeper crisis than we thought, we need some more financial assistance from the IMF, well, then the IMF will say, okay, you can dip into your second tranche of your quota, and maybe into your third tranche, and even into your fourth tranche. But as you ask for these so-called upper tranches, the second, third, fourth tranche of your quota, the IMF is going to impose conditions. What these conditions are is the IMF telling the country, we will give you the financial assistance, but first, we want you to change some things. We want you to make some policy changes in your economic policies that we think probably got you into this crisis in the first place. And usually these policy changes, they're policies that I think are very interesting. They have a significant, uh, you know, point of view to the IMF's policies. Let's talk about that. What the IMF does is these conditions will be the kinds of things. If you look at this set of conditions, and now I should have made the word conditionality highlighted in blue there to match up with this list of conditions, because we are now on point number 3, conditionality. And what you see here is a list of the typical IMF conditions. And so these conditions are the kinds of things that the IMF, the policies the IMF wants the country to adopt, that the IMF believes would help keep that country from getting into a crisis like this again. And look at the kind of conditions. You might notice that they all are the common theme to these conditions is, at least most of them, is reducing government intervention in the economy. And this reflects the IMF's liberal point of view, right? The IMF definitely has this liberal viewpoint that less government intervention is better, right? They clearly do believe in some government intervention from time to time. The IMF, after all, is an institution composed of representatives of many governments. It's a multilateral government institution, and the IMF itself does intervene, right? In these crises, it intervenes. It helps the country. But that kind of government intervention is just meant to be limited and short-term and just enough to get the country back on its feet and back on track financially. And so these conditions are the IMF's way of saying, look, we believe the reason you got into the crisis is perhaps you had too much government spending. Perhaps you had a massive budget deficit, right? Perhaps you were spending so much money you weren't able to sell enough government bonds to finance your expenditures. Your foreign debt was so big that now you're in a crisis, right? You're resorting to perhaps printing money. And that in turn can cause problems. That can cause high inflation. That high inflation can make it difficult for you to export your products. That can result in a big current account deficit, which you'll have to finance by selling government bonds, right? To bring in a capital account surplus to balance out your current account deficit. And so the IMF said, now you could be in a situation with twin deficits. You're financing both of these deficits by government bonds. Your foreign debt is rising. You're on the brink of default. You're on a terrible crisis. Nobody will lend money to you except the IMF, the lender of last resort. We will come in, we'll help you, but we want to ask you to fix some of these things, to change some of these policies that got you in trouble in the first place. For example, excessive government spending. Reduce that government spending. Cut the budget deficit. This is do you see, the IMF sees this as sort of the root cause of many of the problems that countries get into. So that is a typical IMF condition, right? What is another thing the IMF might recommend? They don't like to see increased taxes, but they would like to see increased collection of taxes, right? Because that would reduce the budget deficit. So often they might advocate those kinds of things. They might even recommend increased tax rates, but they mainly want to see increased tax revenues. In the short term, the IMF might even say, and if you look at all of these policies, they have a very specific reason. Look at this. They might say, raise interest rates. Now, why would the IMF do that? Well, if you think about it, a country in this kind of balance of payments crisis typically is having difficulty exporting its products. It's importing a lot of things. It has a very large current account deficit. If the country raises interest rates, if the IMF demands that the government, central bank, raise interest rates, that would raise interest rates on government bonds. That would raise interest rates on money market instruments and other kinds of things. So suddenly now that might attract foreign capital back into the country. That would result in a capital account surplus, which would help balance the country's balance of payments. You see what we're doing here? This could actually stabilize the country's currency. This currency devaluation might never happen now because the IMF would say, raise interest rates, and it's a short-term fix to bringing in a big capital account surplus to a country that is experiencing a massive current account deficit and possibly investors pulling their money out. If you raise interest rates, at least some investors might say, well, those government bonds are very risky, but they're maybe, 17% rate of return, 20% rate of return. Maybe it's worth investing in those government bonds. And so that brings in a capital account surplus to help balance out the balance of payments and stabilize the country's exchange rate. And that's the IMF's mission. So that's what the IMF is trying to do with these exchange rates, you see, with these conditions. And so look at these other conditions. Raise interest rate. Now, this is an odd one. Why would the IMF recommend liberalizing tariff barriers? Now, let's look at this condition in more detail. So you see all of these kind of typical IMF conditions. Why would they recommend trade liberalization, the reducing of tariff barriers? Wouldn't that contribute to the current account deficit? Well, the IMF's argument is, well, if the country does that, that might force, at least in the long term, in the short term, it could result in increased imports. But in the long term, it could force that country's industries to be competitive. Maybe they've been protected for too many years by protectionist policies, by high tariff barriers, by import substitution industrialization policies, which just means high levels of import taxes, right, to keep out the imports. Countries under those kinds of government interventionist policies, the IMF argues, become less competitive. The industries don't have to be, competitive in world markets, and they might become stagnant and less innovative and less competitive over time. So what the IMF recommends is that countries remove those tariff barriers to force the industries to be competitive. It might be kind of painful in the short term, but in the long run, the IMF says the country will be more competitive. So these are the reasons the IMF imposes these kind of conditions. Let's look at another one. Remove restrictions on foreign investment, especially foreign direct investment. The IMF, of course, would like this because the IMF, let's look at that, the balance of payments. If the country has a big current account deficit, what does it need? It needs a large capital account surplus, a bigger inflow of foreign capital, either foreign direct investment, which is more stable and more likely to stay, or portfolio capital investment. So by telling the country to raise interest rates, that could bring back more portfolio capital investment. But, if you remove restrictions on foreign investment, especially foreign direct investment, well, that could bring in a big capital account surplus. So this is the IMF's rationale. This is why it is putting these kinds of conditions on these countries that it provides assistance to. It sort of makes sense. Some of these conditions, however, are a little bit more controversial. For example, often the IMF will tell the country, hey, it's too difficult in your country. You have too many labor laws that make it very difficult for companies to fire workers. So we would like you to make those labor laws a little more flexible, make it possible for companies, if they need to, if they have too many employees, maybe they need to reduce their workforce. Maybe they need to save some money. Allow them to do that. Reduce the rigidity of the labor laws. Make them more flexible and encourage companies to fire workers if they need to. That will make those companies more competitive. That will make foreign investors more inclined to invest in countries that have flexible labor laws. That will help this country's economy improve. And so again, the IMF has very much this kind of liberal, market-oriented mindset that it believes a rising tide lifts all boats. Yes, reducing the rigidity of the labor laws, making it easier to fire workers. Well, in the short term, that could result in a lot of workers getting fired. But in the long run, that flexibility for companies, that will make those companies more inclined to invest, more inclined to expand, make them more competitive, and that will boost the economy overall, and that will be a win-win for everybody. So if you look at these kinds of conditions, you look at them, it's really only as a last resort that the IMF recommends a devaluation because, after all, that's what it's trying to avoid. It's trying to help a country with this kind of balance of payments crisis to prevent that massive devaluation from happening, to prevent the disruption in the global economy. But sometimes as a last resort, that's what it sometimes recommends. Now, if you look at all of these conditions together, I think, and you see them one by one, and you see the IMF's logic to them, well, it sort of makes sense from that IMF embedded liberal point of view. But obviously, the structuralist critics and the economic nationalist critics don't completely agree with the IMF's thought process on this, and sometimes say that maybe the IMF is doing these things for other reasons. And so we'll talk about that in the next segment.